Hello again, this is Walter, the English Conversation Doctor, coming to you from Tokyo, Japan. And today we're going to be looking at the first lesson in the Root of All English series. And we're going to be covering data input issues. Now, when I say data input in class, a lot of students are looking at me like, huh? But what that basically means is listening skills. So we're going to look at this from a very technological standpoint, because like I mentioned before, your brain works exactly like a computer. So if we break it down to computer terms, then it might be easier for most of you to understand. So to get started, let's look at the way that a computer works, right? In order for a computer to work, it has to do three things. First, it has to be able to receive data, right? So we have to have data input of some kind. Then it has to move to data processing, and then after it's processed the data, that's when it can actually give you actual output or something like printed to the screen, right? So for us IT guys, this is pretty simple to understand. But what happens if a computer cannot receive data? Now, for a computer, the data is normally zeros and ones. That's about all it can read. If a computer cannot receive data, that means that it can't move to the next step, which is processing information. If it can't process information, then of course there's not going to be any output. This is the exact same thing that happens to a lot of English students in Japan. So for humans, data input basically comes from our five senses, right? But the main two senses that we use for data input, that we normally rely on for data input, are sight and sound, right? So in the case of most English students, their primary problem when it comes to dealing with the English language is that they cannot receive data, meaning basically they have trouble hearing English. So that's the main problem that we're going to tackle today. And I'm going to show you some very easy ways to deal with this. But, as I always say, before we can find a solution to the problem, we first need to look at the root cause of it. For students in Japan who have been studying English for a long time, the reasons why they have problems with listening to English are not necessarily their fault. One reason why they continue to have problems listening to English is because of the way they were taught English in the first place, right? As I keep on mentioning, Japanese students have learned the English language backwards. So they learn academic skills first, like reading, writing, grammar, and vocabulary, before they had a base of listening and speaking. Now they find themselves trying to play catch up on the data input side, when actually that's the first step of the process that they need in order to learn how to speak English fluently, right? So that's problem number one. Problem number two is also related to the way that they were taught English, or rather, who was teaching them English. Japan has a very funny system when it comes to the way English is taught. So when you teach at a high school or a junior high school around here, normally you have a senior teacher, or the normal English teacher is a native Japanese teacher. And then the assistant language teacher is the foreign guy or foreign girl. The problem with this is that a lot of schools do not have a steady ALT, assistant language instructor, who's a native English speaker. So most of their students are stuck with the regular English teacher. Unfortunately, the regular English teacher is probably, in most cases, has not lived abroad for a very long time. They just went to school for English. So, in the classroom, when the teacher is reading English, he's like, please turn to your page. His pronunciation is completely off the charts wrong. So students go through high school listening to incorrect pronunciation. A lot of students tell me, like, well, I've been studying English for 10 years, but my pronunciation is still bad. And I tell them, that's okay. Your English teacher's pronunciation was probably worse than yours. That's why you have this problem, right? So, and there's other factors that kind of contribute to this. But the fact that Japanese students do not use English in their daily lifestyle makes it very hard for them to work on their listening skills, because they have nobody to talk to and they have nobody to kind of bounce feedback off of, right? And another reason why students continue to have this problem is because of what they're being taught at English language schools in Japan. So when you go to an English language school in Japan, they turn English listening into something very complex. And they tell students, okay, you have to be able to actively listen, so pay attention to everything that a native English speaker says. And if you really want to speak fluent English, you must first be able to understand every single word that a native English speaker says. And this is what they preach to a lot of students. So when I meet students, they're very freaked out about learning how to listen to English. Like, oh no, I can't listen, I can't listen. Well, I'm here to tell you that you can, and it's actually a lot easier than you think. What we need to do now is we need to look at how to solve this problem. If you'll notice, a few lessons back in the course, I went over something called Pareto's principle, or the 80-20 rule. And I'm here to show you that listening to English is actually a lot easier than you think. Okay, now what normally happens to students when they first come to my class, before they know anything about my system, is I will give them a listening test. And I tell them, I'm going to play a video for you, or play the CD. I want you to listen to the CD, and then I'm going to ask you questions. So, this is where the problems start. As soon as I hit the play button, I noticed that all of my students in my class, they've got their notebooks and their pens ready, and as soon as I hit the play button, all of them focus on the conversation. Boom! I mean, they're like staring at my iPhone as if they can move it telepathically, right? So I'll let the video play, or I'll let the presentation play, and then after that, I'll ask the students some questions. I'm like, okay, so what was the presenter's name? I don't know. Give me a summary of his presentation. I don't know. How many number of attendees were in this business meeting? I don't know. This is where I have to stop them and show them what they've done wrong. See, what Japanese students of English tend to forget is that they are not native English speakers, right? They've been told that they're supposed to be for some reason, but that's not true. So realistically, if English is not part of your daily lifestyle, or you don't use English regularly on a daily basis, then catching 100% of a native English-speaking conversation is impossible, right? You can't do it. The reason for this is because if you're talking to me, my speed is too fast for you. My vocabulary range is much larger. I know words that you don't know. I know grammar. I know phrases that you're not familiar with. So, if you focus on my conversation and you think that you are actually going to understand everything, I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen, right? So what happens with students is when I start playing the CD, for the first maybe 30 seconds, they're okay. It's like, hi, my name is Walter. And then they're like, okay, his name is Walter, I understand that, and blah, 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 blah. Eventually, the presenter or the CD is going to say one vocabulary word they don't know. And at that point, everything stops. It's like, oh my God, what is this vocabulary word? I don't know what this is. But the presentation or the CD keeps on going, right? And the student's mind is still stuck back here, right? Focusing on this vocabulary word that they don't know. Then later, eventually they figure out, okay, I don't know this word. And they look over here, aha, there's another word they don't know. And the whole world crumbles, right? So at the end of the presentation, when I ask them, okay, what was he talking about? The standard answer is, I don't know. So remember, for most Japanese students of English who have not been exposed to English every day, if you try to listen to 100% of an English conversation, you are normally going to wind up with 0. So what I normally teach my students to do is don't do that, right? So I teach my students to listen to English by applying the 80-20 rule. And as I mentioned before, the 80-20 rule, or Pareto's law, basically states that 80% of everything that you do is garbage, which means that it's not necessary, or even worse, a waste of time or energy. So when you are listening to an English conversation, 80% of the words that you're hearing, you may not need to know. Seriously. This is the way that I listen to Japanese. When I go to a Japanese presentation or I go to a Japanese business meeting, I realize I am not native Japanese. I don't even study Japanese, really, but I still have to go. So what I do when I walk into the room is I realize, okay, I am probably not going to understand even half of this conversation. So my listening style is this. I start at 0. And the speaker will start talking, and I listen like this. Okay, blah, 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 blah. I don't know this word. I don't know this word. I don't know this word. Ah, cheap hamburgers, McDonald's, Shibuya, tomorrow. Okay. Next week, TGI Fridays, Roppongi Hills. Ka-chong. And that's all I listen for. So after the presentation is finished, what I do is I take these little small pieces of information, and like if somebody asks me a question, like, Walter, do you understand what we were talking about? Oh, yeah. So like tomorrow we're going to go to Shibuya to eat cheap hamburgers with our friends. And then next week we're going to TGI Fridays in Roppongi Hills. How can I do that? Because I am not listening for the entire conversation. I'm only listening for words that I can hear, and I'm only listening for certain points. This is a very easy and stress-free way of listening to English. So instead of listening for 100% or even 80% of a conversation, I'm only listening for 20%. Just the key points. That's it. Right? Everything else, garbage. So, I know this principle might sound a little bit strange or a little bit hard for you to understand at the moment, but it's really not. Because, you use this all the time anyway. Now, we're not going to get into a debate of what constitutes active listening and what constitutes passive listening. That's for the English schools and all of these scholar guys to kind of fight over. That's why I call what I teach 80-20 listening. That kind of gets me out of that debate. But you use this all the time because I want you to seriously think about it. When you're talking to your wife or your girlfriend or even your friends, are you focused on their conversation? I mean, are you really listening to them? For example, if your girlfriend or boyfriend says, okay, I want to talk to you. Do you turn and focus on them? Like, okay, I'm going to understand every single word you say. A lot of times, no. Most of the time when you're talking to somebody just regularly in your daily lifestyle, you are doing something else. You're either playing with your cell phone or watching TV, or you're basically ignoring them. But you still hear their conversation for some reason. You're actually using 80-20 listening right there. So you already know how to use this skill. It's just that nobody has told you that you can apply this to English as well, right? So next time you are in a business meeting or next time you're listening to something, and I'll give you a few exercises to practice after this video. But next time you're listening to something and you're having a hard time listening to English, what I want you to do, and this is going to look completely stupid, but I want you to grab something, and it could be a pen, your cell phone, or whatever, and I want you to start playing with whatever you've got in your hand. And I want you to keep your eyes on it, right? And I make my students do this in the class, and they think I'm nuts, but they can't deny the results. So while you're listening to your English video or your English lecture or your TED presentation, play with whatever's in your hand and keep your eyes on it. And then I only want you to write down the words that you hear, right? You'll find out that in most cases, you'll be able to catch a lot more information. That's because when you're talking to your friends, or when you're talking to your husband and wife, or when you're playing with your cell phone, you are not focused on the conversation. You're not filtering words. You're not focused on every word. That means that you're hearing and getting a lot more information. And I don't want you to take my word for this. I want you to try it for yourself, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So you might be wondering why this works so well. I'll give you a little bit of the psychological side of it. Basically, your brain has a filter. It's called your conscious mind. So your brain has two sides, your conscious mind and your subconscious. Your conscious brain's function is basically to protect you. And it deals with logic, it deals with handling decisions, and it deals with calculations, right? But his primary function is to protect you. So this means protect you from physical, mental, or any kind of danger. So this guy deals with facts, right? He loves facts, he loves data. And if there's a 0.1% chance that you might be in any kind of danger, his job is to tell you don't do it, right? or to block that information. Then you have his little brother over here, your subconscious brain. Now, this guy has no rules, no limitations, and he records everything. So the subconscious mind is complete freedom, and he's automated. This is the guy who keeps your heart beating like when you're asleep at night, so that you don't have to think about it. A good example of the relationship between these two is people who want to go skydiving. So they go to Guam, and they're like, okay, I'm in Guam. I want to go skydiving, man. Little brother over here, he's like, yeah, man, that sounds cool. Let's go. And so they get into the airplane, they strap up, they pack their parachute, and then they're like, they're flying at, 3,000 feet. And little brother's still happy. He's like, okay, yeah, man, we're going to do this. Woo! The skydiving instructor will tell him, okay, it's your turn. And so the guy gets up. He's like got his pack all on and all strapped in. And then he's at the door. He's like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And little brother's like, oh, yeah, let's go for it. And then right before he's about to jump, big brother wakes up. He's like, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Now, statistically speaking, this is not the safest thing for you to be doing. Are you absolutely sure that your parachute is packed correctly? There is a 0.1% chance that you made a mistake. So if you jump, you will die. And that's why the guy's like, maybe next time. And a lot of times they don't jump. Right? It's the same thing like when a guy sees an attractive girl that he wants to speak to. A lot of times little brother's like, wow, yeah, I think you can totally get her phone number. Go for it. And so he starts walking towards her, and then big brother wakes up. He's like, but she's taller than you, and she's obviously got a lot of money, and you may not be her type, so she might reject you. So the safest thing for you to do is back off, right? And that's what a lot of guys do. So what you should start to notice is that little brother and big brother don't really get along that well, right? Because little brother really does think that you can do everything. I mean, this is the guy that's in charge of your dreams. So he really does believe that anything is possible, and he really doesn't have any limits. That's what this guy's for, right? To keep you from saying, oh, okay, I can walk through that fire, right? So the problem is big brother is so protective of you that a lot of times he blocks information, right? This is what happens to students of English when they're too focused on listening to a conversation. An English speaker will be talking, and the student's very, very zoned in on the conversation. What he's actually doing is big brother is kind of monitoring the information that he's getting. And when he hears a vocabulary word that he's not familiar with, little brother's like, okay, yeah, I'll take that. But big brother over here, he's like, no, wait a minute. You don't know this word. I cannot find this word. It's not in your dictionary. Identify, compute. And he goes into a loop trying to find out what this word actually means. And eventually, he's gonna, if he can't find it in your mental database, he blocks it. He cuts it out. He's like, okay, you don't know this word. Go for the next one. Right? And by that time, you've got a string of about 5 or 6 words that big brother can't identify. So he's like, you do not understand this conversation. You do not understand 100% of this conversation. Therefore, you cannot make a summary because you are not sure exactly 100% of what has been said. That's why when someone asks you, okay, so did you understand? Big brother tells you, say no. Now, what this technique does, the funny technique that I just showed you, and the reason why you get more information when you're doing something else, when you're actually just hearing English instead of trying to listen to it, is because Big Brother's weakness is that, he pretty much likes to single task whenever possible, right? So when you're playing with something or when you're doing something else, Big Brother is focused on what you're doing. If you're typing a text message, he's watching you type to make sure that you don't make any mistakes. When you're walking up the stairs, he's making sure that you don't make any mistakes. When Big Brother is distracted, that means that Little Brother is free to roam, right? So, when my students are doing this in class, Big Brother's thinking, don't drop the phone, don't drop the phone. Little Brother's like, freedom! And he's running around getting all of these words, accepting all of these words that Big Brother would normally reject. So that's why, when someone asks you, when you're not paying attention and somebody asks you if you heard a conversation, a lot of times you can give them an answer. Now, if you're still not sure how 80-20 listening works, here's another very good example for you. When you go to sleep at night, a lot of times you're not paying attention to your surroundings. But if somebody comes up to your door and starts jiggling the door handle, or somebody tries opening your window, or you hear a sound that you're not familiar with, you wake up, don't you? Right? Or if you're in the woods camping and it's nighttime and you hear leaves crackling, you're going to wake up. That's because this is a natural defense for your body. See, your ears also work as a defensive mechanism, right? Or a early warning system. So, when you're asleep, your ears are programmed to listen to your surroundings, even if you're not paying attention to what's going on around you, right? This is designed to protect you from predators, right? So it's like an evolutionary skill, like, if you're sleeping in the woods and you hear leaves crackling, you're going to wake up to see if it's a bear or not, right? And that gives you time to run or fight, right? So, this is why humans naturally have the ability to do this, right? Like I mentioned before, a lot of students just don't know that they can use the exact same skills for listening to English. Now, when it comes to using the 80-20 rule for listening to English, there are a few questions that remain to be answered. So students are like, okay, so 80% of what I'm listening to is garbage information. I don't need it. Yay! But where do I get the 20% that I need? Very good question. Now, in Japan, the speaking style and presentation style is normally flat, which means that people don't use a lot of voice tone, right? But when you're dealing with native English speakers, we use voice tone and body language quite a bit. So when it comes to 80-20 listening, the only thing you're really focused on getting during a conversation is intonation, right? See, whenever I say something important, my voice will change. And it can change, like if I say something positive, my voice normally goes up. If I say something negative or not so nice, my voice might go down. This is what you're listening for in a native speak conversation. Because unless my voice tone changes, that probably means that what I'm saying isn't really that important. So the first thing that you're going to look for is intonation, and we'll play with that in some of the exercises after this video. The next thing that you're going to look for is keywords. When I'm listening to a conversation from somebody I don't know or somebody that I can't hear, or during a telephone conference, if I can't hear voice tone, I'm like, okay, this guy's talking on the phone, his voice tone is dead, I can't really catch his emotion. Fine. What I start looking for then is I start looking for keywords. And the keywords that you're looking for really aren't that difficult. You're basically looking for a person, place, thing, times, dates, numbers, and events or action points. Those are about the 8 things that you really, really need to get. So during a phone conversation, if you can hear these 8 points, then you can take this data and put it into a summary. And when somebody asks you a question about where you're going to be meeting next week and with who, you can say, oh yeah, I'm meeting with Walter in Roppongi Hills at 7:30 on December 4th, and we're going to have hamburgers. And you can do this because you didn't try to hear the entire conversation. And another good thing about this 80-20 listening is that it helps to eliminate accents. Because you're not listening to the whole conversation, then it doesn't really matter if the guy is speaking Indian English, American English, British English, or whatever, because you're not listening to most of the words in the sentence anyway. You're only looking for key words. That's it, right? So you're basically doing what a secretary does. This also helps to increase your listening speed, and it helps you pick data out of a conversation faster. So it's a very stress-free way of listening to English. By reducing the amount of data that you are trying to get from a conversation, and only focusing on picking out the key words or voice tone, then you'll actually wind up getting a lot more valuable information. One thing I want you to know is that listening to English is not necessarily about quantity, right? It's more about quality of the words that you can actively catch and understand. And for people who are studying presentations or studying speaking, one thing that I always tell them is that it doesn't matter how many big vocabulary you can say. What matters is how many people can understand you, right? And that's kind of the same thing that you're looking for when it comes to listening. You're not looking to catch all of these big sophisticated words. You're looking to understand the conversation so that you can make a summary and so that you can speak. That's it. So I don't want students to think that listening to English is some big, huge mystery that you need a Ouija board to figure out. It's not. Because the same way you listen to Japanese is the same way you should listen to English. So the secret to listening to English is don't listen to English. Hear it. Try to hear words that you can easily get, that you can understand, and try to make a summary based on that. Of course, you don't want your listening skills to stay at 20%. You want to increase this eventually to like 20, 30, 40, 50, and eventually 100. But that takes a lot of time. And that's more of an active listening skill because your ability to catch more words depends on how many words you actually know. So that's more of a vocabulary issue. How many words you can actually identify and understand. And that's a skill that we'll cover later. But, just remember, when it comes to listening, your only purpose is to understand. That's it. So the biggest mistake that students make when they're trying to listen to English is listening too much, right? Because they're just catching a lot of garbage information that they may not need anyway. This technique is especially effective for business meetings and teleconferences, and that's something that we will go over later in the course as well. So that's about it for this video. The best way for you to learn how to use 80-20 listening is to practical application. So what I want you to do now is I want you to go through some of the supplementary materials and try some of the activities below to practice this 80-20 listening and see for yourself how well it works. After that, you're free to move on to the next section.